The afternoon sun hit the imported hardwood floors of the Buckhead estate, casting long shadows across the vast living room. I laid on the custom leather sectional, my right hip throbbing with a dull, constant ache. The titanium pins from the recent fracture surgery were a daily reminder of my limits. The television blasted a college football game at a volume that shook the crystal glasses in the dining room cabinet. Tyrell sat in the center of the room, sprawled across the expensive armchair I bought 3 years ago. He was 41 years old, dressed in designer sweatpants that cost more than a decent car payment, shouting aggressively at the screen. My throat felt like sandpaper. The pain medication always left me severely parched. The kitchen island was only 20 feet away, but with a fractured hip it might as well have been a mile. My aluminum crutches leaned against the sofa, cold and completely uninviting. I looked at Tyrell. He did not blink, his eyes glued to the massive flat screen I paid for. "Tyrell, I need a glass of water," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. He did not move. He did not acknowledge me at all. The crowd on the television roared, masking the heavy silence in the room. I waited 10 seconds. I'd spent 35 years as an IRS forensic auditor, tracking billions in hidden assets, taking down men much smarter than him. I knew exactly how to wait. "Tyrell, I need some water," I repeated slightly louder this time. He slowly turned his head. His eyes met mine, and there was absolutely no warmth in them. There was only the cold, hard stare of a man who believed he held all the power. "Get it yourself," he said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "I am not your servant, old man." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I did not flinch. I did not yell back. I simply watched him. I watched the absolute arrogance of a man sitting in my house, watching my television, drinking my expensive bourbon, and telling me to fetch my own water. A man whose struggling logistics company, Apex Freight, had conveniently moved its operations into my home address 2 years ago. Aaliyah sat at the kitchen counter, just out of his line of sight. My beautiful daughter, 38 years old, raised with everything she ever wanted. She had her mother's sharp eyes, but lately she had adopted her husband's selective hearing. She was scrolling through her phone perfectly still. She heard him. The house was open concept, the acoustics designed to carry sound perfectly from the living room. She heard every single word of his blatant disrespect. "Aaliyah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She did not look up. Her thumb continued to flick across the bright illuminated screen. She took a slow sip of her sparkling water, completely ignoring the thick tension radiating from the living room. That silence broke something deep inside me. It was not just the physical pain of my injured hip. It was the crushing realization that my own flesh and blood had chosen the side of a parasite. I'd spent my entire career building this estate. I audited the worst of the worst, ruthless men who tried to hide their greed behind shell companies and offshore accounts. I built a massive fortress of wealth to protect my family. And now the true enemy was not hiding in a corporate ledger. The enemy was sitting in my living room, wearing expensive cologne and refusing a crippled man a basic human courtesy. Tyrell turned back to the game, laughing loudly as a player fumbled the ball. He thought the interaction was over. He thought he had successfully established dominance. He thought he was dealing with a frail 72-year-old man whose best days were far behind him. He forgot what I did for a living. He forgot that I made a long career out of ruining arrogant men who thought they were legally untouchable. I gripped the thick armrest of the sofa. The premium leather groaned under my shifting weight. I reached for the cold aluminum of my crutches. Every slight movement sent a spike of white-hot pain radiating directly up my spine, but I refused to show it. I hauled myself upright, balancing carefully on my good leg, adjusting the crutches firmly under my arms. Tyrell did not even offer a hand. He took another long sip of bourbon and cheered loudly at the television screen. He had made his choice and I had made mine. I began the slow, agonizing walk to the kitchen. Each step was a brutal physical battle. The rubber tips of the crutches squeaked loudly against the pristine hardwood floor, a rhythm of sheer determination. I focused intensely on my breathing, inhaling sharply through my nose, exhaling slowly through my mouth. I passed right by Tyrell. I could smell the expensive alcohol on his breath, the heavy musk of his designer cologne. He glanced up for a fraction of a second, a dark smirk playing on his lips, before turning his attention back to the game. He truly thought he had won. He thought he had broken me in my own home, reducing me to a helpless burden. I reached the kitchen island, heavily leaning against the cool marble countertop. Aaliyah finally looked up from her phone, her expression completely unreadable. She did not apologize. She did not offer to help pour the water. She simply watched me struggle to fill a heavy glass from the refrigerator dispenser. I took a long, slow drink of the icy water. It felt like absolute ice sliding down my dry throat, sharpening my tired senses, completely clearing away the thick fog of the pain medication. I looked at the condensation on the glass in my hand, then looked out toward the living room where Tyrell was screaming insults at a referee on the screen. I did not feel any sudden anger. Anger is sloppy and anger makes foolish mistakes. I felt absolute clarity. The kind of cold, calculated clarity that I used to feel right before I froze a billionaire's hidden bank accounts. Tyrell had just made the single biggest mistake of his life, and he had absolutely no idea that the countdown timer to his destruction had just started ticking. I stood at the edge of the kitchen island, letting the icy water cool my throat. The pain in my hip was a dull roar, but my mind had never been sharper. I watched Tyrell from across the expansive room. He was completely relaxed, sinking deep into the custom Italian leather of a chair he did not pay for. He rested his bare feet right on the edge of the antique mahogany coffee table. That table was an anniversary gift from my late wife, imported directly from a dealer in Milan. Tyrell treated it like a cheap footstool in a rundown apartment. He was living a billionaire lifestyle on a retired auditor's dime. I shifted my gaze to Aaliyah, my own daughter sitting barely 5 feet away from me. She finally put her phone down, but she refused to make eye contact. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle on her silk blouse. She knew her husband was out of line, but she chose the path of least resistance. I realized then that the daughter I raised to be fierce had been slowly replaced by a passive stranger. She was protecting her fragile marriage by sacrificing my dignity. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but an auditor only deals in cold facts. The fact was, I was entirely alone in this fight. For 3 long years, I had played the role of the accommodating father. I smiled at their awkward dinners. I ignored the missing bottles of vintage wine, and I turned a blind eye to the muddy footprints on the Persian rugs. I told myself it was temporary, that Apex Freight would eventually stabilize and they would move into their own place. That was a lie. Tyrell had no intention of leaving. He was nesting. He was measuring the drapes and sizing up the square footage. He saw an old man with a broken hip and assumed the throne was empty. My performance as the helpless elder was officially over. I set the empty crystal glass softly into the stainless steel sink. I gripped the thick rubber handles of my aluminum crutches. The journey back across the living room felt entirely different this time. Before I was a wounded animal seeking basic survival. Now I was a predator silently stalking a very loud prey. I moved deliberately, letting the squeak of the rubber tips announce my approach. Tyrell was still yelling at the television screen, a vein bulging on his thick neck. He was so completely absorbed in the flashing colors that he did not even notice my shadow falling over him. I stopped right behind his chair. I could smell the stale bourbon and the greasy takeout food radiating from his clothes. The television announcers were screaming about a controversial penalty flag. I leaned down slowly, fighting the sharp, agonizing burn in my fractured hip. I brought my face just inches from his ear. "You just made the most expensive mistake of your entire life, son," I whispered. My voice was barely a breath, but it cut right through the noise of the crowd. Tyrell flinched, swatting at his ear like a bothersome fly had landed there. He turned his head slightly, his eyes half closed, heavily glazed from the liquor. "What are you muttering about now, old man?" Tyrell slurred, not even bothering to look me in the eye. "Just go lie down and stay out of my way." He turned back to the game, immediately forgetting my presence. He brushed off the warning like it was the senseless rambling of a senile fool. That was his fatal flaw. He confused physical frailty with mental weakness. He thought a broken hip meant a broken spirit. He did not realize that the man standing behind him had once dismantled a massive international smuggling ring with nothing but a ballpoint pen and a stack of bank ledgers. I did not say another word. I simply stood straight, adjusted my crutches, and continued my slow walk down the long hallway. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of my steps, leaving me in total silence. I passed the grand staircase, ignoring the elevator I usually took to my bedroom. Instead, I headed straight for the heavy oak doors of my private study. It was a room Tyrell rarely entered because it smelled like old books and hard work. Two things he absolutely despised. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the cool darkness of the room. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the bright afternoon sun. I hobbled over to the massive, leather executive chair behind my solid mahogany desk. I sank into the seat, letting the crutches clatter loudly onto the hardwood floor. I did not need them in here. In this room, I was not a crippled old man. I was a master architect sitting at my drafting table. I reached out and pressed the power button on my secure desktop computer. The large monitors flared to life, casting a cold blue glow across my weathered face. I cracked my knuckles, feeling the familiar stiff joints of a man who had typed 1,000,000 pages of evidence. Tyrell thought he controlled the narrative because he could shout the loudest. But true power does not shout. True power works quietly in the dead of night, pulling the invisible strings until the puppet suddenly collapses. I opened a blank digital document. It was time to audit my own son-in-law. It was time to follow the money, find the rot, and tear his entire fake empire straight down to the foundation. I waited until the grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight. The heavy bass of the football game was long gone, replaced by the quiet hum of the central air conditioning. My hip was stiff from sitting in the leather chair for hours, but the throbbing had faded into a dull background noise. I listened carefully to the massive house. I heard the faint, heavy snoring of Tyrell coming from the master suite upstairs, a room he had claimed for himself 2 years ago. Aaliyah was probably asleep beside him, or maybe staring at the ceiling, wondering how her life became this quiet tragedy. I did not care right now. I had a job to do. I slid my reading glasses down my nose and focused on the glowing computer monitors. My fingers, thick with arthritis, hovered over the mechanical keyboard. For 35 years, these hands had ripped apart the financial lies of cartels, crooked politicians, and arrogant businessmen. Tyrell was just a boy playing a man's game. I opened the secure web browser and typed in the web address for the Georgia Secretary of State Business Registry. It was the absolute first stop in any forensic audit. You follow the corporate filings, and the filings tell you the truth. I hit the enter key, waiting for the familiar government seal to load on my screen. Instead, the browser spun for a few seconds, and then a stark white warning page popped up. Access denied. The page claimed the site was restricted by the local network administrator. I sat back in my heavy chair, letting out a low, dry chuckle. I tried the county property tax portal. Access denied. I tried the federal corporate tax lookup. Access denied. Tyrell had put a digital deadbolt on my own internet router. He had locked down the network in my house, specifically blocking government and financial public record websites. He wanted to make sure his senile, crippled father-in-law could never accidentally stumble onto his business records. It was a cowardly, calculated move. It proved he was actively hiding something massive, and it proved he thought I was a technologically illiterate old fool. Let me tell you something about network restrictions built by amateur con men. They're like cheap padlocks on a screen door. They only keep out honest people or lazy people. Before I retired as a senior auditor, the agency sent me to advanced cybersecurity training in Quantico. We learned how to crack encrypted offshore banking servers using nothing but raw code. Tyrell had simply logged into my internet provider application and clicked a few parental control buttons. It was insulting. I opened the system command prompt. The black screen with the blinking white cursor appeared a blank canvas for a digital wrecking ball. I did not even need to look at my keyboard. I typed a sequence of administrative override commands, bypassing the primary router completely and rerouting my connection through a secure virtual private network based out of Switzerland. It took me exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I hit the enter key one last time. The screen refreshed completely, wiping away Tyrell's childish digital fence. The official seal of the Georgia Secretary of State Business Registry loaded perfectly on my right monitor. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the old thrill of the hunt settling into my bones. The trap was open, and the rat was waiting in the dark. I typed the words Apex Freight into the search bar. I hit search and watched the database pull up the public records. The screen flooded with documents, annual reports, and registration forms. I opened the most recent filing from last year. I read the name of the registered agent first. It was Tyrell Jenkins. I read the listed business purpose, which claimed domestic logistics and heavy freight transport. Then my eyes drifted down to the official registered business address. I stopped breathing for a second. The address glowing back at me on the screen was my address. He had registered his failing logistics company directly to my Buckhead estate. He did not ask my permission. He did not even mention it in passing. He simply stole my legal residence, using my unblemished property as a shield for his corporate operations. Do you know what it means when a man registers his business to your house without telling you? It means every single lawsuit, every collection agency, and every angry creditor legally looks at your front door for their money. If he goes down, he anchors his sinking ship straight to your foundation. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the blue screen. The physical pain in my hip was completely gone, replaced by a cold, burning focus. Tyrell was not just a rude house guest. He was a financial parasite, quietly draining my legacy while treating me like a stray dog. He thought he was untouchable, sleeping soundly in my upstairs bedroom. He had no idea that the old hound he kicked had just caught his scent. I stared at the glowing blue screen, letting the cold reality of the situation wash over me. Tyrell had attached his entire corporate existence directly to my front door. I did not panic. Panic is for amateurs, and I was a master of my craft. I leaned closer to the monitor, adjusting my glasses. It was time to open the books. I clicked on the Financial Disclosure tab for Apex Freight. The loading icon spun for a fraction of a second before the annual reports filled my screen. I opened the tax documents for the past 3 fiscal years. The numbers were neatly arranged in columns, trying to present a picture of legitimate success. In the first year of operation, Apex Freight reported gross revenue of $1.2 million. In the second year, that number climbed to $2.8 million. By the third year, Tyrell was reporting $4.5 million in gross revenue. To the untrained eye, he looked like a rising star in the Atlanta logistics scene. But I did not have an untrained eye. I scrolled down to the bottom line looking for the net operating income. I looked at the declared profit for year 1. It was 0. I looked at year 2. It was exactly 0. I looked at year 3, the year he brought in $4.5 million. The declared profit was perfectly 0. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, rubbing my tired eyes. Let me explain something to you about corporate tax filings. A legitimate business with heavy overhead might show a massive loss. They might buy new transport trucks or expand their warehouse space and write those heavy expenses off. But a company pulling in nearly $5 million does not land on a perfect 0 for profit 3 years in a row. That is mathematically impossible in the real world. A perfect 0 means the books are completely cooked. In my 35 years at the agency, I took down cartel money launderers and corrupt hedge fund managers. They all made the exact same mistake. They thought they were smarter than the math. Tyrell was using a classic money diversion scheme. He was inflating his operating expenses with fake invoices, pouring the incoming cash into a black hole. It means every single dollar of revenue is being carefully matched with a phantom expense. The money is coming in the front door, and it is immediately being shoved out the back door. Tyrell was bleeding his own company dry. He was either drowning in an ocean of secret debt, or he was intentionally diverting the funds into an offshore account. Either way, Apex Freight was not a logistics company. It was a massive financial illusion. Suddenly, his absolute arrogance in my living room made perfect sense. He was not just a lazy son-in-law refusing to hand a crippled man a glass of water. He was a cornered animal pretending to be a king. He wore expensive designer sweatpants and drank my vintage bourbon to project an image of extreme wealth. But behind the digital curtain, he was broke. He was shuffling millions of dollars around, desperately trying to keep the heavy plate spinning. I thought about Aaliyah sleeping upstairs next to this massive fraud. I remembered the way she stared blankly at her phone while he insulted me. She was trapped in a marriage built on a mountain of lies. I felt a tight knot of regret in my chest. I should have demanded to see the books when he first moved in. I wanted to believe he was just a struggling entrepreneur who needed a safe harbor, but this was not a safe harbor. If the federal government decided to audit Apex Freight, they would come right here to my Buckhead estate. They would freeze my bank accounts, put a lien on my property, and drag my family into a massive federal indictment. He was using my lifetime of clean, honest work as a human shield for his massive financial crimes. I needed physical proof. Digital records are a great starting point, but a grand jury wants to see the actual paper trail. They want to see the collection notices, the late payment warnings, the desperate letters from angry creditors. If Tyrell was drowning in secret debt, the sharks were definitely circling. And if they were circling, they were sending their threat letters straight to the registered business address. They were sending them directly to my house. I looked at the digital clock glowing in the bottom corner of my screen. It was almost 2 a.m. The house was completely silent. I closed the secure browser and wiped the search history clean. I pushed myself up from the heavy leather chair, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in my fractured hip. I did not reach for my crutches. I needed my hands completely free. I was going hunting in my own house. The study was pitch black except for the pale moonlight spilling through the gap in the heavy velvet curtains. I stood perfectly still, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. My fractured hip was screaming at me, but I forced the pain into a small, tight box in the back of my mind. Tyrell was sloppy, and sloppy men always leave a paper trail. I just needed to find where he buried the bodies. I thought about the Daily Mail routine. Every afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock, the postal worker dropped the mail into the brass slot on the front porch. For the last 2 years, Tyrell was always the first one to the door. He claimed he was just being helpful, grabbing the stack of letters before my bad hip forced me to walk over there. It was not kindness. It was a daily interception mission. He was filtering the mail, removing the toxic waste of his failing business before I could ever lay eyes on it. But a man cannot just vaporize paper, he has to throw it away. Tyrell was too lazy to buy a personal paper shredder, and he was too arrogant to burn it in the backyard fire pit. I limped slowly across the thick Persian rug, heading straight for the corner of the room. There was a large woven leather recycling bin sitting quietly next to a mahogany bookshelf. The housekeeper usually emptied it on Fridays, but today was only Wednesday. I dropped down to my knees. The sudden movement sent a sharp, agonizing jolt of electricity down my right leg. I gritted my teeth, breathing heavily through my nose, refusing to make a single sound. I reached my thick, calloused hands into the dark bin and began pulling out handfuls of crumpled paper. At first, it was just useless junk mail. Glossy car dealership flyers, credit card offers addressed to me, and empty envelopes from utility bills. I kept digging, pushing aside the useless clutter. My fingers brushed against a thick, stiff piece of paper folded sharply into a tight square. I pulled it out and held it up to the pale moonlight. The bold red ink across the top of the page was completely unmistakable. It was a final collection notice. I grabbed my small brass desk lamp, pulling it down to the floor, and clicked it on. The dim yellow light illuminated the devastating truth. The letter was from a commercial freight leasing company in Chicago. They were demanding immediate payment for 3 transport trucks. The outstanding balance was $145,000. The letter was addressed directly to Apex Freight at my exact Buckhead estate address. I did not stop there. I plunged both hands back into the recycling bin, tearing through the discarded papers like a starving man searching for a meal. I found another envelope aggressively torn open. It was a formal breach of contract lawsuit from a warehouse facility in Savannah. They were suing Tyrell for unpaid storage fees totaling nearly $80,000. I laid the documents flat on the carpet, smoothing out the deep creases with the palm of my hand. The stack began to grow piece by piece, building a massive monument to his absolute failure. There was a demand letter from a corporate insurance broker for $50,000 in unpaid premiums. There was a threatening notice from a private logistics contractor demanding payment for services rendered. Then I found the absolute worst piece of paper a businessman can ever receive. It was a thick official envelope from the Internal Revenue Service. It was a notice of intent to levy. Tyrell had not paid his federal payroll taxes in over 18 months. The federal government was demanding $230,000 immediately. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the crumpled evidence of a collapsing empire. I closed my eyes, running the heavy numbers through my head. I'd spent 35 years auditing the most complex financial webs in the country, so the arithmetic was second nature to me. 145,000, 80,000, 50,000, 230,000. I kept adding the smaller collection notices, the late fees, the mounting penalties. The grand total was staggering. Tyrell was hiding almost $900,000 in toxic default debt. He was nearly $1 million in the hole. I looked at the aggressive, threatening language on the letters. These were not polite reminders. These were the final angry warnings before the creditors started seizing assets. And because Tyrell had secretly registered his fraudulent company to my home, my assets were in the direct line of fire. They would come for the house. They would come for the cars. They would attempt to drain my retirement accounts to satisfy his massive, reckless negligence. He sat in my living room wearing designer sweatpants, drinking my expensive bourbon, acting like he owned the entire world. Meanwhile, he was a completely broke, desperate man, standing on the edge of a massive financial cliff, and he had deliberately tied a heavy rope around my neck, planning to drag me down with him. I carefully gathered every single piece of paper, folding them neatly and placing them into a thick manila folder. I locked the folder inside the heavy iron safe hidden behind a false panel in my desk. Digital records can be debated, but signed physical collection letters are undeniable proof. I slowly pulled myself back up to my feet, leaning heavily on the edge of the mahogany desk. The physical pain was intense, but my mind was completely clear. I knew exactly what he was running from, and I knew exactly how desperate he truly was. Desperate men do not just hide mail. Desperate men take extreme, violent measures to secure a lifeline. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was almost 3 in the morning. In a few hours, the sun would rise, and Tyrell would walk down the grand staircase with his fake smile. He would go into the kitchen and he would prepare my morning recovery pills. A cold, dark realization washed over me, chilling me right to the bone. I sat in the dark study, watching the sky turn from pitch black to a pale, bruised purple. By 6 in the morning, the heavy Georgia heat was already pressing against the thick window glass. I had not slept a single minute. My mind was racing, building a massive, terrifying timeline of Tyrell and his absolute treachery. The nearly $1 million in hidden corporate debt was a solid, undeniable motive. It was the desperate reason a man would do something truly unforgivable to his own family. Aaliyah was still asleep upstairs, completely unaware that her husband was a financial ticking time bomb. I unlocked the heavy mahogany study door and made my slow, agonizing way toward the massive kitchen. I leaned heavily on my aluminum crutches, letting the rubber tips squeak loudly against the pristine hardwood floor. I wanted them to hear me coming. I wanted to play the exact character Tyrell expected to see every single morning. A broken, tired, 72-year-old man rapidly losing his grip on the world. At exactly 7:15, I heard the heavy footsteps coming down the grand staircase. Tyrell walked into the kitchen wearing expensive silk pajamas, running a hand through his perfectly faded haircut. He looked completely rested, completely without a single care in the world. He walked straight over to the expensive Italian espresso machine, completely ignoring the fact that he had brutally insulted me in my own living room just 14 hours ago. "Morning, Pop," Tyrell said, his voice dripping with a fake sugary warmth. "How is that fractured hip feeling today?" I stood near the massive marble island, leaning on my crutches, watching him open the sleek wooden cabinet above the sink. "I'm hanging in there," I replied, keeping my voice intentionally weak and slightly unfocused. I rubbed my eyes, pretending to be deeply confused by the bright morning light. Tyrell pulled down a small plastic pill organizer. My orthopedic surgeon had prescribed standard calcium and basic over-the-counter pain medication for the bone healing process. But exactly 3 months ago, Tyrell had generously offered to manage my daily medication routine. He claimed my vision was getting bad, and he wanted to make sure I took the correct dosages at the right times. He told Aaliyah he was just trying to be a good, supportive son-in-law stepping up to help the family. I watched him pop open the plastic lid for Wednesday. He tapped 3 small capsules into a tiny paper cup. For the last 90 days, I'd been losing massive blocks of time. I would walk into a room and completely forget why I was there. I would struggle to find simple everyday words during casual conversations with my own daughter. I would lose my reading glasses, my keys, my leather wallet on a daily basis. I blamed it on the stress of the hip fracture, the hospital stay, and the heavy physical trauma. I honestly thought I was simply getting old, and my sharp, analytical mind was finally beginning to completely dull. It was a terrifying, deeply humiliating feeling, slowly losing your grip on reality while trapped inside your own failing body. But looking at Tyrell smiling his predatory smile, the pieces violently locked into place. The sudden terrifying brain fog perfectly aligned with the exact week he took control of my morning routine. He was not giving me calcium. He was not helping my bones heal. I spent my entire career tracking financial fraud, and I knew that elder abuse always follows a very specific, ruthless pattern. You create the illusion of incompetence, you document the severe decline, and then you quietly steal the massive estate. "Here you go," Tyrell said, pushing a small glass of water and the tiny paper cup across the cold marble island. Your daily recovery supplements. We have got to keep that mind and body sharp, right? I looked down at the 3 small pills. 2 were plain white, and 1 was a pale, chalky blue. They had no medical markings, no standard pharmaceutical stamps. They were completely anonymous. I felt a cold, terrifying chill run directly down my spine. A man drowning in $1 million of toxic debt does not have the luxury of waiting for an old man to quietly pass away. He accelerates the timeline. He chemically erases the final obstacle. I reached out with a trembling, heavily veined hand, playing the role of the broken, grateful elder perfectly. I picked up the 3 small capsules. I brought my hand to my mouth, tossing my head back and taking a large, greedy gulp of the cold, filtered water. But the pills never passed my lips. I slid them expertly under my tongue, dropping my hand back to my side in one fluid, practiced motion. It was a sleight of hand trick I learned decades ago during a very dangerous undercover audit in Miami when ruthless men tried to slide illegal cash across the table. Tyrell watched me swallow the water, his eyes tracking the movement of my throat very closely. I saw a brief, undeniable flash of absolute satisfaction cross his face. He believed his vicious plan was working perfectly. He believed he was slowly erasing my mind, one morning at a time. He believed he was chemically paving the way for a complete medical guardianship takeover. "Thank you, son," I said, my voice raspy and pathetic. "I'm just so tired lately. My head feels like it is packed with thick, heavy cotton. I do not know what is wrong with my memory." Tyrell chuckled, turning his back to me to pour his expensive espresso. "That is just the natural healing process," he said, dismissively taking a slow sip from his tiny cup. "You just need to rest and let me handle all the heavy lifting around here. Do not worry about a single thing, Pop. I've got everything completely under control." I stared at his broad back, feeling the chalky, bitter taste of the unknown pills slowly dissolving against the bottom of my mouth. He had absolutely no idea exactly who he was dealing with. I turned around slowly, leaning heavily on my crutches, and began the long walk back toward my private downstairs bathroom. I needed to get to a sink and spit the literal poison out before it completely absorbed into my bloodstream. He thought he was playing a brilliant, flawless game of chess against a weak opponent. But he was just a desperate, sloppy criminal who just handed a retired federal forensic investigator the exact physical evidence needed to absolutely destroy his entire life. I closed the heavy oak door of the downstairs powder room and immediately twisted the brass lock. The satisfying click echoed in the small, marble-tiled space. I dropped my aluminum crutches to the floor, where they clattered loudly. A sound I knew Tyrell would hear from the kitchen and interpret as my usual clumsy struggle. I leaned heavily over the polished porcelain sink and spit the 3 partially dissolved capsules directly into the palm of my hand. I turned on the cold water tap, cupping my other hand, and frantically rinsed my mouth. I swished the freezing water around my gums and spit it down the drain, repeating the process 5 times. I wanted every single trace of that bitter, chalky chemical completely out of my system. I patted my face dry with a thick Egyptian cotton towel, taking a moment to stare at my reflection in the gilded mirror. The man looking back at me was tired, with deep bags under his brown eyes and gray hair thinning at the temples. But the sheer panic that had clouded those eyes for the last 3 months, the terrifying fear of losing my own mind, was completely gone. I was not going crazy. I was being methodically poisoned right inside my own home by the man sleeping next to my only daughter. I looked down at the 3 damp pills resting in the center of my palm. The blue dye was slightly bleeding onto my skin. This was not just a hunch anymore. This was tangible physical evidence of a severe felony. I pulled a small, clear plastic evidence bag from a discreet travel kit inside the vanity drawer. During my 35 years as a federal forensic auditor, I never fully unpacked my emergency go bag. Old habits die hard. especially when your life depends on them. I carefully dropped the damp capsules into the plastic bag, sealing the airtight zipper tight. I retrieved my crutches, unlocked the bathroom door, and began the slow, agonizing trek back down the long hallway straight to my private study. I made sure to drag my right foot slightly intentionally, scuffing the sole of my expensive leather slipper against the hardwood floor. If Tyrell was listening, I needed to sound like a man rapidly deteriorating. I reached the heavy mahogany doors of my study, slipped inside, and locked the door behind me. I moved to my massive desk, pulling open the bottom right drawer. I reached past the hanging files and retrieved a plain, thick manila envelope. I needed an absolute, undeniable chemical analysis of those pills. Local police labs were too slow, and a standard hospital blood test would raise far too many questions, tipping off Tyrell before my trap was fully set. I needed discretion speed and absolute scientific precision. I pulled a heavy sheet of official stationery from my leather desk organizer. I reached for my favorite gold-plated fountain pen, uncapping it with a smooth twist. I began to write a very specific letter to a man named Dr. Elias Vance, the director of an independent toxicology lab located right in the heart of Chicago. Elias and I went way back. 2 decades ago, his private lab helped my federal task force prove a corrupt pharmaceutical executive was intentionally mislabeling dangerous shipments. Elias owed me a massive favor, and he ran the most secure, fiercely independent facility in the entire Midwest. Elias, I wrote, keeping my handwriting sharp and deliberate, I require an expedited, full-spectrum chemical analysis of the enclosed samples. Check for heavy sedatives, cognitive suppressors, and long-term memory inhibitors. Send the certified results to my secure post office box, not my residential address. This is a matter of life and death. I signed my name, folded the heavy paper, and slipped it into the manila envelope right alongside the small plastic bag of damp pills. I sealed the envelope, pressing the adhesive flap down firmly. I printed the Chicago laboratory address on the front and slapped 3 priority stamps in the upper right corner. Now came the difficult part. I could not leave this envelope in the brass mailbox on the front porch. Tyrell intercepted the Daily Mail like a starving hawk. If he saw an outgoing package to a toxicology lab, he would panic, and desperate men do desperate things. I had to get this envelope completely off my property. I checked my gold wristwatch. It was barely 8 in the morning. Aaliyah was probably getting ready for her corporate consulting job, and Tyrell was likely lounging in the massive living room, completely satisfied with his morning poisoning routine. I slipped the thick envelope deep into the interior pocket of my heavy wool cardigan. I grabbed my crutches and walked quietly out the side door of the study, which led directly onto the wraparound stone patio. The thick, humid Georgia heat hit my face instantly. The sprawling green lawn was still wet with morning dew. The nearest blue postal drop box was located exactly 4 blocks down the affluent tree-lined street. For a healthy man, it was a brisk 5-minute walk. For a 72-year-old man with a fractured hip, walking on crutches, it was an absolute marathon of agonizing pain. But I did not hesitate. I moved down the flagstone path, keeping my head down, focusing entirely on the rhythmic squeak of my rubber crutches against the damp pavement. My shoulders burned. My right leg throbbed with a sickening intensity, but my mind was laser-focused. I was not just mailing a letter. I was launching a devastating counteroffensive. I reached the end of my long driveway and turned onto the public sidewalk. The massive oak trees provided some thick shade, hiding me from the view of my own living room windows. Every single step was a brutal battle against my own failing body. Sweat poured down my wrinkled forehead, stinging my eyes, soaking the collar of my shirt. I counted my steps, pushing through the intense, white-hot agony radiating from my titanium pins. 100 steps. 200 steps. I visualized Tyrell sitting in my house laughing at the television, completely unaware that his entire world was about to violently collapse. Finally, the bright blue metal of the postal box appeared in the distance, standing like a silent sentry on the street corner. I hobbled the last 50 yards, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I leaned heavily against the cold metal box, completely exhausted, my hands shaking violently. I reached into my cardigan pocket, pulling out the thick manila envelope. I pulled the metal lever, dropping the package into the dark chute, and let the heavy door slam shut. The sharp clank of the metal echoed down the quiet suburban street. It was done. The physical evidence was on its way to Chicago, out of Tyrell's greedy reach, and on its way to becoming a certified federal weapon. I turned around, facing the long, agonizing walk back to my massive estate. I smiled a tired, grim smile. The pain in my hip was absolutely excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the pain I was about to unleash on my arrogant son-in-law. The brutal walk back to the estate took almost 45 agonizing minutes. By the time I reached the heavy oak front doors, my silk shirt was completely soaked with cold sweat. My right hip was a solid burning block of pure agony, but I forced myself to stand tall, taking 3 deep breaths before turning the brass handle. I needed to look like a man who just woke up from a very long, confused nap. For the next 5 days, I waited for the certified lab results from Chicago. In the world of federal auditing, the waiting period is always the most dangerous phase. It is when the target gets restless, and it is when the investigator has to maintain absolute flawless discipline. I could not just sit around reading the newspaper. I had to give Tyrell exactly what he wanted to see. I had to actively feed his massive ego and build his false sense of absolute security. I began the great performance on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I walked into the massive kitchen, dragging my aluminum crutches heavily across the floor. Tyrell was sitting at the marble island, tapping aggressively on his sleek silver laptop, probably trying to outrun his $1 million debt. I stopped in the center of the room, letting my eyes dart around wildly, acting like a man who had completely lost his geographical bearings. "Tyrell," I said, making my voice tremble slightly. "Have you seen my leather wallet and my heavy brass keys? I cannot seem to find them anywhere." Tyrell stopped typing immediately. He looked up, and I saw the dark, predatory gleam return to his eyes. He slowly closed the laptop, turning his full attention directly to me. "Your keys, Pop?" Tyrell asked, his voice dripping with that fake, suffocating concern. "Where did you leave them last?" "I just do not know," I stammered, raising a trembling hand to my forehead. "I thought I put them on the credenza, but my mind is just so foggy today. Everything feels like it is moving through thick, heavy mud." Tyrell stood up slowly, reaching into the pocket of his designer sweatpants. He pulled out his expensive smartphone. I watched his thumb swipe across the screen, and I knew exactly what he was opening. He was opening the voice memo application. He was actively recording me building a digital timeline of my rapid cognitive decline. "Let us look together," Pop Tyrell said, walking toward me with the phone held casually at his side. The microphone pointed directly at my face. "You have been forgetting a lot of things lately, have you not? It is perfectly okay, we just need to document these little slip-ups so the doctor knows exactly what is going on." I nodded slowly, playing the role of the terrified, helpless elder. We spent 20 minutes searching the massive living room. I eventually found the keys exactly where I'd intentionally hidden them, deep inside the cushions of his favorite leather armchair. Tyrell just shook his head, looking at me with absolute mocking pity. He stopped the recording, slipping the phone back into his pocket, completely satisfied with his new piece of evidence. But losing keys was not enough to secure a federal medical guardianship. He needed proof of severe, undeniable chronological disorientation. He needed to prove that I was completely unmoored from reality. The next evening, we were all sitting around the formal dining table. Aaliyah had ordered expensive Italian takeout, trying to maintain some illusion of a happy family dinner. The tension in the room was incredibly thick. Tyrell was drinking heavy pours of my vintage red wine, his face flushed with arrogance. I pushed my pasta around the porcelain plate, staring blankly at the crystal chandelier above us. "Aaliyah, sweetheart," I said softly, interrupting the heavy silence. "What time is the church service tomorrow morning?" Aaliyah looked up from her plate, her brow deeply furrowed in confusion. "Dad," she said gently, "today is Thursday. Church is not for another 3 days." I let my jaw drop slightly, blinking my eyes in rapid manufactured panic. "Thursday," I repeated, my voice cracking perfectly. "No, that cannot be right. The gardener came today, and he always comes on Saturday. Are you absolutely sure it is Thursday?" Aaliyah reached across the heavy oak table, placing her warm hand over mine. She looked incredibly sad and deeply exhausted. "Yes, Dad," she whispered. "It is Thursday night. You just got a little confused, that is all." I looked over at Tyrell. He was not looking at me. He was staring down at his phone beneath the table, his thumbs moving rapidly across the digital keyboard. He was taking detailed notes. He was logging the date, the time, and the exact nature of my severe chronological delusion. He was building a comprehensive medical dossier, bullet point by bullet point, preparing to hand it over to a corrupt judge. "Oh, I see," I mumbled, looking down at my trembling hands. "I'm sorry, I just do not know where my mind is going lately. It is like a dark cloud is settling over my brain." Tyrell finally looked up, flashing a bright, reassuring smile that made my stomach completely turn. "Do not you worry about a single thing, Pop," he said smoothly. "We are going to take excellent care of you. We are going to make sure you get the exact kind of professional help you truly need." I nodded gratefully, taking a slow sip of my ice water. Every morning I continued to palm his poisonous pills, flushing them safely down the toilet. Every afternoon I manufactured a new, terrifying symptom for his digital diary. I forgot the name of my own financial advisor. I left the front door wide open. I put the television remote directly inside the stainless steel refrigerator, and every single time I slipped, Tyrell was right there watching with absolute glee. He documented every mistake, completely convinced he was watching my mighty intellect crumble into dust. He thought he was the brilliant predator slowly circling a dying, helpless lion. He had absolutely no idea that the lion was fully awake, carefully counting the predator's exact footsteps and waiting for the perfect moment to completely tear his throat out. The performance was flawless and the trap was finally set. Now I just needed the laboratory in Chicago to hand me the final nail for his coffin. The waiting finally ended on a muggy Monday morning. Tyrell threw on a tailored suit, grabbed his expensive leather briefcase, and kissed Aaliyah on the cheek. He told us he had a massive logistics meeting downtown, trying to secure a major shipping contract. I knew it was a complete lie. He was probably meeting with a bankruptcy lawyer or begging a loan shark for a heavy extension. Aaliyah left for her corporate consulting firm shortly after, her face completely exhausted. The moment the heavy front door clicked shut, the massive house fell completely silent. I was finally alone, and I had exactly 4 hours before anyone came back. I picked up my smartphone and dialed a private black car service I frequently used during my federal working days. I did not use a standard ride-sharing application because Tyrell had open access to our shared family account. I needed this trip to remain entirely off the digital grid. The sleek black sedan pulled up to the end of my long driveway exactly 15 minutes later. I grabbed my aluminum crutches, locked the front door, and made the slow, painful walk to the waiting car. "Take me to the main postal annex on Piedmont Road," I told the driver, settling deeply into the cool leather seat. The drive took exactly 20 minutes. I watched the sprawling, wealthy neighborhoods of Buckhead roll by my mind, completely focused on the Chicago laboratory. When we arrived at the massive brick post office, I asked the driver to wait by the curb with the engine still running. I hobbled through the sliding glass doors, the cold air conditioning hitting my sweaty face. I walked past the long lines of impatient people heading straight for the private rental boxes in the back corridor. I pulled a small brass key from my pocket, my hands trembling slightly. I unlocked box number 412, a secure drop point I had maintained for over a decade. Inside the dark metal box sat a single plain white envelope. There was no return address, just my name and the box number printed in block letters. Elias had followed my strict instructions perfectly. I slid the envelope into my interior jacket pocket, locked the brass box, and made my slow way back to the waiting sedan. "Take me home," I told the driver, my voice sounding incredibly hollow. I did not open the envelope in the car. I needed to be sitting at my heavy mahogany desk in the absolute safety of my private study, surrounded by the thick walls of my own fortress. When I finally returned to the estate, the silence of the house felt incredibly heavy. I walked directly to the study, locked the heavy oak door, and sat down in my executive leather chair. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the crutches fall loudly to the floor. I reached into my jacket, pulled out the plain white envelope, and used my vintage gold pen to slice the paper open. There were exactly 3 pages inside, printed on heavy laboratory stock. I skipped past the standard methodology section and the long chain of custody documentation. My eyes scanned the dense clinical paragraphs, searching for the final certified conclusion. Dr. Elias Vance did not mince his professional words. The chemical breakdown was laid out in brutal, undeniable clarity. The primary compound identified, the report stated, is a highly potent, unregulated benzodiazepine derivative. It is traditionally utilized in severe psychiatric environments to rapidly suppress central nervous system functions. The secondary compounds include heavy synthetic tranquilizers explicitly designed to disrupt short-term memory retention and induce severe cognitive disorientation. These specific dosages, administered daily, will perfectly mimic the aggressive onset of advanced dementia. I read the terrifying paragraph 3 times, letting the cold, clinical language burn directly into my brain. Tyrell was not just slipping me basic sleeping pills. He was giving me military-grade chemical suppressors. He was actively destroying the neural pathways in my brain, intentionally turning a sharp 72-year-old man into a drooling, confused vegetable. I placed the 3 pages gently on the smooth mahogany wood. I felt a cold, deep rage spreading through my chest, replacing the blood in my veins with absolute ice. During my 35 years as a federal forensic auditor, I had seen incredible greed. I had seen brothers steal from brothers and executives bankrupt entire communities. But this was an entirely different level of pure, unadulterated evil. This was not just a simple financial theft. This was the methodical chemical murder of my personal identity. The massive, terrifying scope of his plan suddenly became perfectly clear to me. The $1 million in hidden corporate debt, the fake logistics company registered directly to my address, the daily video recordings of my manufactured memory loss. It was all leading to one specific, devastating legal maneuver. He was building a bulletproof case for a hostile medical guardianship. Let me tell you how the dark side of the legal system truly works. If Tyrell could convince a corrupt or lazy judge that I was completely incapacitated by severe dementia, the court would quickly strip away every single one of my human rights. They would declare me legally incompetent. They would hand Tyrell absolute unchecked control over my bank accounts, my retirement funds, and my massive Buckhead estate. He would become my total master, and I would become his legal prisoner. Once he had the official conservatorship, he would immediately lock me away in a cheap state-run nursing home, heavily sedated and completely forgotten. Then he would quietly liquidate my entire life. He would sell this beautiful house, pay off his massive toxic debts, and live like an absolute king with my daughter completely trapped by his side. By the time anyone realized what he had actually done, The money would be completely gone and I would be dead in a lonely hospital bed. I sat perfectly still, listening to the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the long hallway. He wanted to play a dangerous high-stakes legal game. He wanted to use the family court system to legally steal my entire legacy. I picked up the certified laboratory report and locked it inside my heavy iron safe right next to the massive stack of his hidden collection notices. I had the complete financial motive, and I now had the certified physical weapon. Tyrell thought he was a legal mastermind, but he forgot one crucial detail. He was trying to steal from a man who spent his entire life writing the ultimate rulebook on federal prosecution. I was not going to a nursing home. I was going downtown to build an absolute legal fortress that would legally trap him forever. The next morning, I sat at the marble kitchen island, sipping a dark cup of black coffee. Tyrell practically bounced down the stairs, whistling a cheerful, arrogant tune. He poured his espresso, eyeing me like a prized calf headed for the slaughterhouse. I let my hands shake, rattling the ceramic mug against the saucer, playing the terrified victim to absolute perfection. "I have a doctor appointment at 10 o'clock, I said, keeping my voice weak and thoroughly defeated. The memory lapses are getting worse. I think I finally need a professional evaluation." Tyrell stopped whistling immediately. His eyes lit up with a greedy, predatory fire. He placed his cup down, walking over with that sickening, manufactured concern. "That is the smartest thing you have said in weeks, Pop," Tyrell said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Do you want me to drive you? I can come into the exam room and help explain your symptoms to the doctor." I shook my head slowly, staring blankly at the polished marble counter. "No," I replied softly. "The clinic is sending a specialized medical transport van. They said they have a wheelchair lift just in case my hip acts up. I need to do this alone, son. It is a matter of pride." Tyrell smiled a massive, triumphant smile. He patted my shoulder, completely thrilled that I was voluntarily marching straight into his medical trap. "Take all the time you need," he said smoothly. "We just want what is best for your long-term care." At exactly 9:30, a sleek black medical transport van pulled into my long circular driveway. I had paid the private transport company $500 in cash, specifically requesting heavily tinted windows. Tyrell stood on the front porch, watching me struggle onto the hydraulic lift with my aluminum crutches. He waved a cheerful goodbye, completely convinced I was heading to a neurologist to sign away my own mental competence. As soon as the heavy metal doors closed and the van pulled out onto the main road, the frail, confused old man vanished completely. I sat up straight in the leather transport seat, pulling a thick manila folder from my dark wool coat. I tapped the thick glass partition separating me from the driver. "Take me to the Bank of America Plaza," I ordered, my voice ringing with sharp, absolute authority. "Floor 52. The drive downtown took 40 minutes. The massive, towering glass skyscraper pierced the bright Atlanta skyline, a monument to immense corporate power. The transport driver wheeled me through the pristine marble lobby past the heavily armed private security guards. We rode the private executive elevator, silently rocketing up to the 52nd floor. The polished brass letters on the thick glass doors simply read Jenkins and Associates. There were no flashy advertisements, no long lists of legal specialties. When your law firm occupies the entire top floor of the tallest building in the city, you do not need to advertise. You only take the calls of billionaires, massive estates, and high-level federal fixers. I pushed my crutches across the imported slate floor, approaching the massive reception desk. The receptionist did not ask for my name. She simply pressed a silent button under her desk, and the heavy oak doors to the inner sanctum swung open. Valerie Jenkins stood waiting in the center of her massive corner office. She was 60 years old, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit, her silver hair pulled back into a severe, perfect knot. She charged $2,000 an hour, and she was worth every single penny. Valerie was not just a brilliant estate attorney. She was a legal executioner. During my days as a federal auditor, we worked 3 massive racketeering cases together. She knew exactly how I operated, and I knew she possessed absolutely no mercy for greedy parasites. Roland, Valerie said, walking over to shake my hand with a firm, bone-crushing grip. You look terrible. But your eyes are completely sharp. What kind of mess brings an old federal wolf out of retirement? I did not exchange pleasantries. I limped over to her massive, solid mahogany conference table and dropped my heavy manila folder directly in the center. I pulled out the certified toxicology report from the Chicago laboratory, sliding it across the polished wood. Then I pulled out the thick stack of collection notices, the federal tax liens, and the fake registered agent filings for Apex Freight. My son-in-law is trying to murder my mind, I said, taking a slow, deep breath to steady my absolute rage. He is nearly $1 million in toxic corporate debt. He registered his failing logistics company to my Buckhead address. And for the last 90 days, he has been poisoning my morning coffee with heavy, unregulated military sedatives. Valerie did not gasp. She did not express fake, polite shock. She simply picked up the toxicology report, her cold, calculating eyes scanning the chemical breakdown. She read the collection notices, doing the rapid mental math, instantly understanding the massive financial motive. She placed the documents back on the table, folding her hands neatly in front of her. He is building a medical paper trail, Valerie stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. He wants to establish severe cognitive decline, drag you into family court, and secure a hostile medical conservatorship. Once he has the legal power of attorney, he will liquidate this massive estate and leave you rotting in a state facility. Exactly, I replied, leaning heavily on my crutches. He thinks he is playing a brilliant game of chess. He thinks I'm a drooling, helpless victim. Valerie smiled a very thin, terrifying smile. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the massive Atlanta skyline, like a queen surveying her kingdom. Well, Roland, Valerie said softly, turning back to face me. Your son-in-law made a fatal miscalculation. He brought a cheap pocket knife to a massive thermonuclear war. What exactly do you want to do to him? I want a fortress, I said, my voice dripping with cold, absolute certainty. I want a legal structure so incredibly complex and so fiercely impenetrable that he will break his own teeth trying to bite into my legacy. Valerie walked back to her massive mahogany desk and pulled a heavy legal pad from the top drawer. She did not need to consult a single law book because she wrote half the estate laws in the entire state of Georgia. We are not just going to build a simple wall, Valerie said, her pen hovering over the thick yellow paper. We are going to build an absolute impenetrable vault, and we are going to throw the only key directly into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. I sat down heavily in the premium leather guest chair, letting my aluminum crutches rest against the solid armrest. Tell me exactly how we trap him, I said, feeling a massive surge of pure, focused adrenaline. An irrevocable living trust. Valerie stated, her voice incredibly sharp and precise. It is the absolute nuclear option of high-wealth estate planning. Right now, your specific name is printed on the deed to the massive Buckhead estate. If Tyrell manages to secure a medical conservatorship, a corrupt judge gives him complete legal control over everything with your name on it. He becomes your absolute legal master, and he can sell your beautiful house tomorrow. I nodded slowly, following her cold, flawless logic. But if we use the trust, I replied, my voice perfectly steady. Valerie smiled a dangerous, deeply predatory smile. If we successfully execute an irrevocable living trust, you legally transfer the complete ownership of the estate and all of your massive liquid assets directly into the legal trust entity. The legal trust becomes the absolute, undisputed owner. You are no longer the legal owner of your own house, you are merely the designated beneficiary. I leaned forward in the heavy leather chair, completely understanding the brilliant, devastating legal trap. If I do not technically own the massive house, I said then, Tyrell cannot legally steal the massive house. Exactly, Valerie confirmed, tapping her expensive silver pen against the polished mahogany wood. Even if he manages to bribe a corrupt private doctor, and even if he fully convinces a blind family court judge that you are completely insane, it will not matter at all. A conservatorship only gives him strict control over your personal assets. But your personal assets will be exactly zero. He will spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in aggressive legal fees only to force open a completely empty vault. It was an absolute masterpiece of legal violence. Tyrell thought he was playing a brilliant, flawless offensive game, but he was running full speed toward a massive, invisible brick wall. He was poisoning me every single morning, desperately trying to steal a massive generational fortune that was about to legally vaporize into thin air. Draft the complex documents immediately. I ordered, my voice hard and completely uncompromising. I want the massive Buckhead estate, the vintage European car collection, and all 3 of my federal retirement portfolios transferred directly into the irrevocable trust by the end of the business day. Valerie did not hesitate for a single second. She pressed a sleek silver intercom button on her desk, summoning her senior corporate paralegal into the room. For the next 3 long hours, I sat quietly in that massive corner office, watching a highly trained legal strike team execute my absolute defense. They rapidly drafted the complex transfer deeds, the strict beneficiary clauses, and the ironclad protective financial covenants. I named Aliyah as the primary secondary beneficiary, but I included a massive, completely unbreakable legal condition. The strict trust explicitly stated that no significant funds or physical property could ever be transferred, sold, or leveraged as long as she remained legally married to Tyrell Jenkins. I was fiercely protecting my only daughter from her own blind, foolish loyalty, locking her out of the massive vault until the greedy parasite was completely removed from her life. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a thick stack of heavy watermarked legal documents sat neatly in front of me. A certified state public notary stood quietly in the corner of the bright room, holding a heavy brass impression stamp. "Sign right here on the bottom line," Valerie said, pointing a manicured finger to the final page. "Once the black ink dries, you are legally and officially penniless, and your massive family legacy is completely bulletproof." I picked up my vintage gold fountain pen. My thick, calloused hand was not shaking at all. The terrified, confused old man was completely dead and deeply buried. I signed my full name with a sharp, aggressive flourish, pressing the heavy gold nib deeply into the thick, expensive paper. The quiet notary stepped forward heavily, pressing his brass seal into the final document, making the massive transfer official, legally binding, and absolutely permanent. Tyrell had spent 2 long years carefully measuring the massive square footage of my beautiful home. He had spent the last 90 days maliciously slipping heavy military sedatives into my morning coffee. He had illegally registered his fraudulent logistics company to my personal address, racking up nearly $1 million in toxic corporate debt, completely banking on a massive sudden inheritance to save his pathetic life. But with a single swift stroke of my gold pen, I had completely neutralized his entire pathetic existence. I stood up from the deep leather chair, grabbing my aluminum crutches with a renewed, fierce physical energy. The agonizing pain in my fractured hip was completely overshadowed by the sweet taste of absolute victory. "File these heavy deeds with the county clerk before 5 o'clock today," I told Valerie, slipping the certified copies into my interior coat pocket. "It will be fully recorded in the public registry by the end of the hour," Valerie promised, walking me slowly to the heavy oak doors of her massive office. "What is your exact next move, Roland?" I smiled a cold, completely humorless smile, adjusting my heavy wool coat. "I'm going to go back to my house," I replied softly. "I'm going to drink my poisoned morning coffee, and I'm going to watch a completely dead man walk confidently around his own open grave." The private medical transport van dropped me off at the end of my long, winding driveway. I made sure to hunch my shoulders and drag my right foot heavily as I walked up the sweeping stone path. The Georgia afternoon heat was completely oppressive, pressing down on my heavy wool coat. I unlocked the massive front door, letting it swing shut with a heavy, solid click. The house was completely quiet, but the air conditioning was running full blast, cooling the sweat on my forehead. I placed my crutches carefully on the thick foyer rug, leaning them against the mahogany console table. I did not need them right now. I walked silently in my soft leather slippers, moving with the quiet grace of a man who spent decades stalking financial ghosts. I headed toward the back of the massive estate, toward the sprawling stone patio that overlooked the pristine, Olympic-sized swimming pool. The heavy glass sliding door was open, just a tiny crack, letting the humid air bleed into the cool living room. I pressed my back tightly against the cool plaster wall, holding my breath completely. Tyrell was standing outside on the expensive flagstone patio, pacing rapidly back and forth like a trapped animal. He was holding his sleek smartphone tightly to his ear, his voice low, but vibrating with absolute undeniable panic. "Listen to me very carefully," Tyrell hissed into the phone, his words clipping together in desperate frustration. "I told you the massive payment is coming. You just have to give me 4 more weeks. The equity in this massive Buckhead property is worth at least $3 million in cold cash." I stood perfectly still in the shadows, letting his desperate confession wash over me. He was talking to a heavy creditor, probably the ruthless warehouse facility in Savannah, or maybe a private loan shark who did not care about corporate LLC protections. "I do not care about the late penalties," Tyrell pleaded, stopping his rapid pacing to run a heavy hand over his face. "Add whatever aggressive interest rate you want to the massive pile. The old man is completely fading fast. I am telling you, his brain is turning into absolute mush. He barely knows what day of the week it is, and he cannot even find his own car keys." I felt a cold, dark satisfaction spreading through my chest. My daily performance was working flawlessly. He was heavily relying on my manufactured dementia, completely banking his actual life on my fabricated mental collapse. "The medical evaluation is already scheduled for next month," Tyrell said, his voice dropping into a sinister, conspiratorial whisper. "I have a private doctor lined up who specializes in rapid guardianship approvals. Once the lazy judge signs the official conservatorship papers, I get absolute legal control of the entire estate. I will take out a massive bridge loan against the property deed the very next morning. You will get every single dime I owe you, plus a heavy bonus for your quiet patience." There was a long, heavy silence on the patio as Tyrell listened to the voice on the other end of the line. The creditor was obviously not impressed with future promises. Desperate men living on borrowed time always think they can smooth talk their way out of a burning building. "No." Tyrell barked suddenly, his voice cracking with genuine absolute terror. "You cannot file the heavy lien against the logistics company yet. If you file the public lien, it alerts the federal tax authorities, and the entire house of cards comes crashing down immediately. I just need 30 short days. I am accelerating the timeline right now. The old man is practically a walking vegetable. Just give me 30 days, and the entire fortune is completely mine." Tyrell abruptly pulled the phone away from his ear, ending the call with a violent, shaking jab of his thumb. He stood at the edge of the pristine pool, breathing heavily, staring down at the crystal-clear water. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a massive cliff, desperately trying to calculate the long, fatal drop. He was accelerating the timeline. The terrifying words echoed loudly in my sharp mind. He was completely out of time and out of terrible excuses. He could no longer wait for the slow chemical decay of his toxic pills to take full effect. He was going to make a massive, aggressive move to force my hand and steal the estate immediately. I slowly backed away from the glass door, retreating into the cool shadows of the long hallway. I walked quietly back to the front foyer, retrieving my aluminum crutches from the mahogany table. I let the rubber tips squeak loudly against the floor, announcing my slow, pathetic return to the main house. Tyrell walked back inside a few moments later, closing the heavy glass door behind him. His face was pale, glistening with a cold, fearful sweat, but he immediately forced a bright, sickening smile when he saw me standing by the grand staircase. "How was the doctor appointment, Pop?" Tyrell asked, his voice dripping with that fake, suffocating sweetness. "Did they figure out why your memory is slipping so badly?" I looked at him with wide, confused eyes, playing the broken old fool one more time. "They just ran some simple tests," I mumbled softly, leaning heavily on the crutches. "They said I just need plenty of rest and good family support." Tyrell walked over and patted my shoulder, his hand trembling slightly from his recent panic attack. "Well," he said smoothly, "you just leave everything to me. I've got a solid plan to take care of you forever." I nodded slowly, turning to make my slow, agonizing way up the grand staircase. He had a plan, and I had a completely empty, legally bulletproof vault. The final explosive collision was coming very soon, and only one of us was going to survive the massive impact. The heavy Georgia sun finally dipped below the thick green tree line, plunging the formal dining room into a deep, moody shadow. Aaliyah had spent the entire afternoon preparing a massive roasted chicken, placing the expensive porcelain platter directly in the center of the heavy oak table. The room was suffocatingly quiet, completely devoid of the usual background television noise. I sat at the head of the long table, letting my aluminum crutches rest against the high back of my custom chair. My fractured right hip was a dull, constant ache, but my mind was completely electric, quietly waiting for the inevitable, violent explosion. Tyrell sat to my immediate left, wearing a crisp, tailored button-down shirt. He poured himself a massive glass of my vintage red wine, drinking half of it down in one single greedy swallow. He was sweating slightly, a thin, undeniable sheen of absolute panic glistening on his dark forehead. He was completely out of time, and he was finally about to make his desperate, incredibly sloppy move. We ate the meal in heavy, agonizing silence for exactly 15 minutes. The only sound in the massive room was the sharp clinking of heavy silver forks scraping against fine porcelain plates. Aaliyah kept her tired eyes completely locked on her food, pushing the roasted vegetables around without eating a single bite. She could easily feel the dark, toxic energy radiating from her husband, but she did not know the massive, terrifying truth hiding underneath his tailored clothes. Tyrell suddenly cleared his throat aggressively, pushing his half-eaten plate away. He reached down into the expensive leather briefcase resting near his feet on the thick Persian rug. He pulled out a thick stack of crisp white legal documents tightly bound by a heavy brass clip. He slid the thick stack across the polished oak wood, stopping it exactly next to my crystal water glass. "Pop," Tyrell said, his voice dripping with a thick, completely artificial syrup. "We need to have a very serious family discussion tonight. I've been talking to some top medical specialists in the city, and we are all very deeply concerned about your rapid cognitive decline." I looked down at the heavy stack of legal papers, then looked up at him, intentionally letting my jaw tremble slightly. "What are these complicated papers, son?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly weak and thoroughly pathetic. "It is just a standard precautionary legal measure," Tyrell replied smoothly, leaning forward and tapping the top page with his thick finger. "It is a comprehensive financial power of attorney and a voluntary medical conservatorship agreement. It just gives me the total legal authority to make the heavy financial and medical decisions for you, since your mind is struggling so badly right now." He tapped the thick paper aggressively, outlining his massive, fraudulent lie. He claimed he needed immediate unchecked access to my primary checking accounts to hire expensive full-time medical nurses. He said he needed to legally leverage the massive equity in the estate to build a safe ground floor medical suite for my recovery. I knew it was an absolute pathetic fabrication. He urgently needed the massive cash to pay off the breach of contract lawsuit in Savannah, and the heavy federal tax liens that were threatening to send him to federal prison. Aaliyah dropped her silver fork. It clattered loudly against her porcelain plate, completely shattering the heavy silence in the room. "Tyrell," she said, her voice shaking with sudden absolute shock. "What in the world are you doing? We never discussed taking away my father's legal rights." Tyrell did not even bother to look at her. His dark, greedy eyes were completely locked onto me, tracking my every movement. "We do not have time to debate this trivial issue, Aaliyah." He snapped his fake supportive mask, finally slipping to reveal the ruthless parasite hiding underneath. "Your father left the front door wide open yesterday. He completely forgot what day of the week it was. He is a massive, walking liability to this entire estate, and I'm finally stepping up to protect our family assets." I reached out with a violently shaking hand, brushing my wrinkled fingertips against the thick, terrifying legal documents. "And what exactly happens if I do not want to sign away my entire life?" I whispered, staring directly into his cold, dead eyes. Tyrell let out a dark, cruel laugh, completely abandoning the supportive son-in-law routine. He took another heavy gulp of the vintage wine, slamming the delicate crystal glass down onto the heavy oak table. "If you do not voluntarily sign those papers tonight," he threatened, his voice dropping into a vicious, terrifying growl, "then I will be forced to call State Adult Protective Services tomorrow morning. I will happily show them the massive digital video diary of your severe dementia. I will have a judge legally declare you a total danger to yourself, and I will have you physically dragged out of this beautiful house by the state authorities." Aaliyah gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. "Tyrell, stop it right now," she cried out, heavy tears suddenly welling up in her dark eyes. "You absolutely cannot threaten to lock my father away." "I am not threatening him," Tyrell shouted, finally turning his absolute unchecked rage toward his own wife. "I am giving him a simple, generous choice. He signs the entire estate over to me right now, or he spends the rest of his pathetic, confused life rotting in a cheap state-run nursing home. He will sit in a dirty wheelchair eating incredibly bland food, completely forgotten by the entire world. His breath smelled like stale alcohol and pure, unchecked desperation. He told me the state facility would take all my retirement money anyway, so I might as well surrender the massive house to him right now. He thought he had me completely backed into a dark, terrifying corner. He had absolutely no idea that the legal deed to this massive estate was already completely locked away inside an impenetrable, irrevocable living trust. He was aggressively demanding the heavy brass keys to a completely empty vault. I sat perfectly still, absorbing his vicious, completely unforgivable threats. I had spent 35 years destroying arrogant, greedy men, but hearing this parasite threaten to lock me in a state facility ignited a cold, absolute fire deep in my soul. I casually reached into the front pocket of my heavy cardigan, my fingers brushing against the small, hidden digital voice recorder. It was completely active, silently capturing every single venomous, illegal threat spilling from his mouth. Tyrell reached into his tailored shirt pocket, pulling out an expensive silver pen. He threw it violently onto the table right on top of the fraudulent legal documents. "Sign the damn papers right now, old man," Tyrell demanded aggressively, crossing his thick arms over his chest. "You are completely out of time, and you are completely out of options." I looked at the heavy silver pen. I looked at the terrifying, binding legal documents. Then I looked across the long table at Aaliyah. The deep, heavy illusion of her perfect marriage was completely shattered, laying in a million sharp pieces on the dining room floor. She was finally seeing the massive, terrifying monster hiding inside her own house. I did not reach for the pen. I just let the heavy, suffocating silence hang in the air, calmly watching Tyrell burn in his own desperate, greedy fire. I slowly pushed the heavy silver pen right back across the polished oak table. I looked Tyrell directly in his dark, furious eyes. "I am incredibly tired, son," I whispered, keeping my voice perfectly frail and completely broken. I cannot read these complex legal documents tonight. I need to sleep on this heavy decision. And we can talk about the medical facility tomorrow morning. Tyrell slammed his thick fist onto the heavy wood. The crystal wine glasses violently shook, spilling dark red drops onto the pristine table. You do not have until tomorrow, old man Tyrell shouted, his face completely twisted with absolute unchecked rage. But Aaliyah abruptly stood up her heavy wooden chair, loudly scraping against the floor. "Leave him alone, Tyrell!" she screamed, her voice echoing sharply in the massive dining room. "He is going to bed right now, and you are not going to say another single word to him tonight." Tyrell glared at her, his jaw tightly clenched, a heavy vein throbbing violently in his thick neck. He grabbed his expensive leather briefcase, leaving the fraudulent power of attorney papers sitting right on the table. He stormed out of the formal dining room, heading straight for the heavy front door. I heard the massive oak door slam shut loudly, rattling the antique window frames. He was probably heading to a dark downtown bar to drink away his massive, suffocating panic. Aaliyah stood completely frozen by the table-hot tears streaming down her exhausted face. She did not look at me. She simply turned around and walked slowly up the grand staircase, completely shattered by the brutal reality of her toxic, parasitic marriage. I waited until the massive house was completely silent. I reached out and picked up his fraudulent legal papers. I folded them neatly, slipping them into the deep pocket of my heavy cardigan. I grabbed my aluminum crutches and made the slow, incredibly quiet walk back to my private study. The terrified, confused old man performance was officially paused for the night. I entered the dark room, locking the heavy mahogany door securely behind me. I walked over to the thick window curtains, pulling them completely shut, blocking out the pale moonlight. I sat down in my heavy leather executive chair and reached deep into the bottom drawer of my massive desk. I bypassed my standard smartphone completely. Tyrell had open access to the local home network, and I was not taking any foolish chances with cheap digital surveillance. I pulled out a heavy encrypted satellite phone, a secure government device I kept perfectly charged for absolute emergencies. I dialed a private, strictly unlisted federal number in Washington. I listened to the heavy, secure static on the encrypted line. The phone rang exactly twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered the secure call. "Special Agent Reed," the strong voice stated, completely devoid of any standard polite greeting. "Darnell," I said smoothly, leaning back into the premium leather chair. "It is Roland Sterling. I need to cash in a very old, very heavy federal favor tonight." There was a brief, stunned silence on the secure line. Darnell Reed was a massive, incredibly sharp man. We had worked side by side for a decade, violently tearing down massive corporate embezzlement rings in Chicago and New York. He was now a senior director for the elite financial crimes division of the Bureau. Roland Darnell said, his voice quickly warming up with deep, genuine respect. "I thought you were sitting on a massive porch in Buckhead sipping expensive bourbon and ignoring the federal government completely. What kind of massive fire are you dealing with down there?" "I have a massive toxic parasite living inside my own house," I replied, keeping my voice incredibly cold and completely precise. "My son-in-law is actively running a massive corporate fraud scheme right out of my personal residence." I did not waste his valuable time with long, emotional family stories. Federal agents do not care about domestic drama. They only care about actionable, undeniable federal felonies. I opened my heavy iron safe, pulling out the thick manila folder of hard physical evidence. "His name is Tyrell Jenkins," I stated, reading directly from the official corporate filings. "He operates a phantom logistics company called Apex Freight. For the last 3 years, he has reported nearly $5 million in gross corporate revenue, with absolutely zero declared net profit. He is actively washing massive amounts of hidden cash, and he's entirely dodging federal payroll taxes. The Internal Revenue Service currently has a heavy, aggressive lien against him for $230,000. Darnell whistled low. a sharp sound of pure professional appreciation. "That is a very sloppy, very massive federal tax violation," Darnell said, the sound of rapid typing echoing loudly on his end of the line. "But that is standard white-collar crime, Roland. Why are you calling me on a secure federal line in the middle of the night?" "Because he legally registered the fraudulent shell company directly to my personal Buckhead address." I continued, my voice hardening into absolute unyielding steel. "He committed massive mail fraud, intentionally intercepting nearly $1 million in toxic debt collection notices. And when he fully realized his fake empire was violently collapsing, he decided to completely liquidate my massive estate to cover his massive debts." I paused, taking a slow, heavy breath. I picked up the certified laboratory report from Chicago. "He's been secretly poisoning my morning coffee for exactly 90 days, I said, the cold fury vibrating deeply in my chest. "He is feeding me heavy, unregulated military sedatives, intentionally destroying my short-term memory. He is building a massive, fraudulent medical dossier to legally declare me totally incompetent. He tried to physically extort my signature on a heavy power of attorney document exactly 20 minutes ago. I have the entire vicious threat completely recorded on a hidden digital device." The rapid typing on the secure line stopped instantly. The heavy, suffocating silence stretched for several long seconds. When Darnell finally spoke, his deep voice was completely drained of any casual warmth. It was the terrifying absolute voice of a senior federal predator locking directly onto a massive, bleeding target. "Roland," Darnell said quietly, "you are absolutely sure about the heavy sedatives and the forged medical extortion?" "I have the certified Chicago toxicology report sitting right in front of me," I replied smoothly. "I have the fraudulent medical conservatorship papers with his distinct fingerprints all over the expensive paper. I have the secret audio recording of him threatening to lock me in a state facility if I do not immediately surrender my massive financial portfolio. Send every single piece of that physical evidence directly to my secure federal drop site," Darnell ordered, his voice clipping with absolute urgent authority. "I am opening a massive, quiet, preliminary review right this exact second. If his fake logistics company is bleeding $5 million, he is likely moving stolen freight across state lines. We will completely audit his shadow bank accounts. We will pull his massive digital footprint, and we will build an absolute bulletproof federal indictment." "How long until you can officially move on him?" I asked, staring coldly at the thick stack of collection notices on my desk. "For a massive interstate corporate fraud combined with aggressive elder abuse and heavy chemical assault," Darnell calculated swiftly. "Give my federal team exactly 72 hours to quietly build the massive trap. Do not let him know we are actively watching him, Roland. You have to keep playing the broken, confused old man. Let him think he is completely winning this massive game." "He already thinks I'm a dead man walking," I replied coldly. "I will send the heavy digital files through the encrypted portal tonight. The physical evidence will be mailed to your secure field office tomorrow morning. Stay incredibly sharp," Roland Darnell warned softly. "Desperate men living on borrowed time make incredibly violent mistakes. I will call you the absolute second the heavy federal warrants are signed by a federal judge." I ended the secure call, placing the heavy satellite phone back into the dark bottom drawer. I leaned back in my executive chair, listening to the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the long hallway. The massive, unstoppable wheels of federal justice were finally turning, silently rolling toward my massive Buckhead estate. Tyrell thought he was a brilliant mastermind, aggressively bullying a crippled 72-year-old man. He thought he could use the family court system to legally steal a massive generational fortune. He had absolutely no idea that a massive team of elite federal financial agents were currently tearing his entire pathetic life apart, piece by piece, completely in the dark. The next 3 days moved with a suffocating heavy tension. I continued my daily performance, shuffling around the massive Buckhead estate on my aluminum crutches. I swallowed the cold water, but I always palmed his toxic blue pills. Tyrell was completely unraveling. I watched him pace the expensive flagstone patio, screaming into his smartphone, his designer clothes looking rumpled and stained with desperate sweat. The shadow creditors were aggressively squeezing his throat, and the phantom logistics company was bleeding out on the floor. He needed a massive injection of rapid cash long before a family court judge could ever sign his fake medical conservatorship. On Thursday afternoon, the heavy doorbell rang. Tyrell was out of the house, probably begging another private loan shark for a heavy extension. Aaliyah was locked in her upstairs home office, completely avoiding the toxic fallout of her shattered marriage. I hobbled to the massive oak front door, pulling it open with a heavy groan. A young man in a cheap, poorly fitted gray suit stood on my stone porch. He looked incredibly nervous, holding a thick manila envelope in his sweating hands. "Are you Roland Sterling?" the young man asked, stepping back slightly from my intense gaze. "I am," I replied, leaning heavily on my crutches. "You have been officially served," he said, quickly shoving the thick envelope toward my chest. He turned around instantly, practically sprinting down my long, circular driveway toward his beat-up sedan. I closed the heavy front door, carrying the thick envelope back to my private study. I sat down in my executive leather chair, slicing the thick paper open with my vintage gold pen. I pulled out a heavy stack of formal court documents filed in the Civil Division of the Fulton County Superior Court. I put on my reading glasses, scanning the aggressive legal jargon with the cold, practiced eye of a federal auditor. Tyrell had actually filed a massive civil lawsuit against me. I let out a low, incredibly dry chuckle. He was suing me for equitable interest in my own massive Buckhead estate. The lawsuit explicitly claimed that Tyrell Jenkins had personally invested $115,000 to completely renovate the massive 4-car garage on my property. He was demanding a heavy immediate cash settlement for his alleged personal financial contribution, or a direct percentage of the massive property deed. I remembered the aggressive garage renovation project from exactly 2 years ago. Tyrell had hired a loud, expensive private contractor to rip out the concrete floors, install custom climate control, and build heavy reinforced steel shelving. He claimed he needed the massive, secure space to temporarily store sensitive logistics equipment for his rising company. I never asked him for a single dime, and I never asked him to upgrade my property. But he did it anyway, completely unprompted, trying to aggressively mark his territory inside my own home. Now the desperate parasite was trying to weaponize that exact renovation. He had hired a cheap strip mall attorney, a man who probably demanded a heavy cash retainer because he knew his client was completely broke. A legitimate high-powered attorney works on contingency because they actually believe in the strong case. A cheap lawyer takes his money completely up front and aggressively files whatever foolish garbage his desperate client demands. Tyrell walked into the house exactly 2 hours later. He found me sitting at the marble kitchen island, holding the heavy civil lawsuit in my trembling hands. I looked up at him, letting my eyes widen with manufactured absolute terror. "What is this massive lawsuit, Tyrell?" I asked, my voice cracking perfectly. "Why are you dragging me into a public courtroom?" Tyrell walked over to the stainless steel refrigerator, pulling out a cold bottle of expensive, sparkling water. He leaned casually against the marble counter, his chest puffed out with absolute sickening arrogance. "It is exactly what it looks like," Pop Tyrell stated, taking a slow, arrogant sip. "I poured over $100,000 of my own hard-earned cash into this massive estate. I upgraded your pathetic garage and I significantly increased your total property value. You owe me that heavy cash back, and I am legally collecting my absolute due." I looked down at the complex legal papers, shaking my head slowly. "But I do not have $100,000 in liquid cash right now," I whispered, playing the trapped, completely helpless victim. Tyrell smiled, a cold, predatory smile. Then you better call your fancy wealth managers and liquidate some of those massive retirement accounts, Tyrell ordered, his voice dripping with complete disdain. Or we can easily settle this quietly tonight. You sign the full medical power of attorney, you give me the absolute legal control, and I will instantly drop this massive civil lawsuit tomorrow morning. He thought he had completely checkmated me. He thought the heavy threat of a messy public civil trial would immediately force a confused, terrified old man to instantly surrender the entire kingdom. He was aggressively using the cheap lawsuit as a blunt instrument of total extortion. I will have to call my lawyer, I mumbled softly, staring blankly at the marble counter. Call whoever you want, old man. Tyrell laughed loudly, turning his back to me. No fancy lawyer can argue with hard physical construction receipts. I have the absolute documented proof of my massive personal investment. You are completely trapped. I watched him walk out of the massive kitchen, completely drunk on his own fake power. He was absolutely right about one thing. His cheap lawyer had aggressively attached the physical construction receipts to the back of the civil lawsuit as the primary exhibit of evidence. I'd already read them very carefully inside my locked study. Tyrell was completely correct that the physical receipts were absolute documented proof, but he was far too incredibly stupid and far too arrogant to understand exactly what they actively proved. He had just handed me a massive, fully loaded shotgun, and he had pointed the heavy barrel directly at his own face. I locked the heavy mahogany door of my private study and walked directly over to my massive executive desk. I did not even bother sitting down. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Valerie Jenkins' private office number. The line rang exactly once before her sharp, professional voice filled the quiet room. Valerie, I said, keeping my voice incredibly low and focused. I just received a massive civil lawsuit delivered right to my front door. My arrogant son-in-law is officially suing me for equitable interest in the Buckhead estate. There was a brief, highly amused silence on the other end of the line. He's suing you for a property he does not even legally own. Valerie asked, a cold hint of genuine laughter in her voice. What exactly is his pathetic legal justification? He claims he personally invested $115,000 to renovate my massive 4-car garage, I explained, looking down at the thick stack of court documents. He hired a cheap strip mall lawyer who filed an aggressive demand for immediate cash restitution. They attached a heavy stack of physical construction receipts right to the back of the official filing as Exhibit B. Valerie hummed softly, the sound of a predator analyzing a fresh bleeding track. Read the physical exhibits to me, Roland, she ordered smoothly. Read me the exact name printed on those expensive construction invoices. I flipped to the back of the thick legal packet. I did not need to read them again because I already knew exactly what they said, but saying it out loud to a ruthless federal attorney felt incredibly satisfying. The primary contractor invoice for the poured concrete, I read, speaking slowly and deliberately. Billed directly to Apex Freight, LLC. The massive receipt for the custom climate control system. Billed directly to Apex Freight, LLC. Every single permit application and every single material purchase is officially registered to his fraudulent logistics company. Not a single piece of paper has Tyrell Jenkins' personal name on it. Valerie let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was the terrifying sound of an elite attorney realizing the opposing counsel had just handed her the entire victory on a silver platter. Roland, Valerie said, her voice dripping with absolute professional delight. I have been practicing high-level corporate law for 30 years. I rarely see an arrogant amateur completely step into his own massive bear trap. He stepped right into it, I agreed, feeling a cold smile stretch across my tired face. Under Georgia corporate law, a limited liability company expenditure absolutely cannot be legally claimed as a personal investment by the owner. The corporate veil exists strictly to completely prevent this exact kind of arrogant conflation. Exactly. Valerie confirmed her sharp mind already aggressively building the massive counterattack. Tyrell cannot legally claim a personal equitable interest in your private property based strictly on heavy payments made by his corporate entity. His cheap lawyer took a heavy cash retainer and completely failed to review his own physical evidence. But it gets significantly worse for him, I added, leaning heavily against the polished wood of my desk. Apex Freight, LLC, is actively reporting absolutely zero net profit to the federal government. They currently owe nearly $1 million to angry creditors, and they are completely dodging massive federal payroll taxes. So where exactly did his failing company magically find $115,000 in liquid cash to renovate a private residential garage? Valerie went completely silent for a few seconds. The massive, devastating reality of his fatal error fully settled into the conversation. He commingled heavily diverted corporate funds. Valerie stated, her voice dropping into a dangerous, lethal whisper. He aggressively embezzled money from his own failing company, used it to upgrade a private residential asset, and then he legally submitted the undeniable physical proof of his massive federal fraud directly into the public court record. He did my entire job for me, I said, looking toward the heavy study door. He officially documented his own massive corporate embezzlement, and he handed the certified copies straight to a county judge. When the elite federal agents from the Bureau pull this civil lawsuit tomorrow, they will have the absolute undisputed evidence they need to completely crush his pathetic empire. I will aggressively file a heavy motion to dismiss by tomorrow morning, Valerie promised, the rapid sound of a computer keyboard clacking loudly in the background. I will aggressively request absolute dismissal with extreme prejudice, and I will demand heavy financial sanctions for a completely frivolous filing. He will absolutely pay for my expensive legal fees out of his own empty pockets. Do it, I ordered, feeling a massive weight finally lifting from my tired shoulders. Let the lazy judge completely destroy his pathetic civil extortion attempt. I hung up the secure phone and looked around the quiet, dark study. Through the thick glass of the heavy window, I could see Tyrell's expensive luxury SUV parked in the massive driveway. He was probably inside the living room, pouring another heavy glass of my vintage bourbon, completely celebrating his brilliant, aggressive legal maneuver. He firmly believed he had completely cornered a broken, terrified old man. He thought the heavy threat of a messy public lawsuit would finally break my fragile mind and force me to completely surrender my entire generational wealth. He had absolutely no idea that he had just officially confessed to a massive federal felony on the public legal record. He had no idea that his own cheap lawyer had just enthusiastically signed his absolute death warrant. The federal trap was completely set, the heavy steel jaws were fully loaded, and the ignorant parasite was happily chewing on the deadly bait. But before the massive federal hammer officially dropped, there was one deeply painful, completely unavoidable task left to do. I needed to walk into the dark kitchen and completely shatter my only daughter's entire world. I needed to finally show Aaliyah the absolute terrifying truth about the monster she married. I waited until the heavy grandfather clock in the hallway struck exactly midnight. The massive house was completely dark and suffocatingly quiet. Tyrell had not returned from his angry, aggressive drive, leaving the massive driveway completely empty. I left my aluminum crutches leaning against the heavy mahogany desk and walked smoothly down the long, carpeted hallway. My fractured hip still ached with a dull throb, but I walked with the firm, steady steps of a man who was fully in control of his own domain. The terrified, completely broken old man routine was officially over for the night. I found Aaliyah sitting completely alone at the massive marble kitchen island. The only light in the incredibly dark room came from the pale blue glow of the digital clock on the stainless steel oven. She was staring blankly into a cold cup of herbal tea, her beautiful face looking completely pale and deeply exhausted. She looked like a woman who had just survived a massive, violent earthquake and was desperately waiting for the terrifying aftershocks to finally hit. Aaliyah, I said softly, keeping my voice completely clear and remarkably strong. She jumped slightly in her heavy wooden chair, looking up at me with wide, completely startled eyes. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with sudden confusion. "You are walking perfectly fine without your heavy crutches. Are you absolutely sure you should be doing that on your bad hip?" I pulled out one of the heavy oak bar stools and sat down directly across from my only daughter. "I am completely fine, sweetheart," I replied, reaching deep into the pocket of my heavy wool cardigan. "I have been completely fine for several weeks, but I needed to play a very dangerous, calculated game to absolutely protect this massive family legacy." I pulled the certified Chicago laboratory report from my pocket, placing it flat on the cold marble counter. I slid the thick, heavy paper toward her trembling hands. "I need you to read this incredibly carefully," I instructed, keeping my voice completely calm and incredibly steady. She looked down at the complex chemical breakdown, her tired eyes rapidly scanning the dense medical paragraphs. "What exactly is this heavy document?" Aaliyah asked, looking back up at me with deep, genuine confusion. "It is a certified toxicology report," I stated flatly, letting the cold reality settle into the dark kitchen. "For the last 90 days, your arrogant husband has been intentionally managing my morning medication. He cheerfully told you he was helping my fractured hip heal properly, but he's been secretly feeding me heavy, unregulated, military sedatives completely designed to violently destroy my short-term memory and aggressively mimic severe early-onset dementia." She physically recoiled from the cold marble counter as if the heavy paper had suddenly caught fire. "No," she gasped loudly, vigorously, shaking her head back and forth. "Tyrell is incredibly selfish, and he is deeply arrogant, but he would never intentionally poison his own family. That is completely insane, Dad. You have to be deeply mistaken." I did not argue with her natural, desperate denial. I simply reached back into my thick pocket, pulling out the small, black digital voice recorder. I placed the heavy metal device on the marble island right next to the certified laboratory report. I pressed the small playback button, turning the volume all the way up, letting the absolute truth speak for itself. The incredibly clear, terrifying audio of the formal dining room confrontation instantly filled the dark kitchen. We both sat in absolute heavy silence, listening to Tyrell's vicious, completely unhinged voice echoing in the dark. I watched my beautiful daughter's face completely shatter as she heard her husband aggressively threaten to lock her father in a state facility. She heard his cold, completely calculated demand to immediately surrender the massive Buckhead estate or rot in a cheap wheelchair forever. She heard him violently call her father a massive walking liability. The digital recording finally clicked off, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the dark room. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background, completely indifferent to the massive family tragedy unfolding. Aaliyah sat completely frozen, her dark eyes wide with absolute undeniable horror. The thick, comforting illusion of her successful corporate marriage completely evaporated in the cold kitchen air. She was finally seeing the massive, terrifying monster hiding inside her own house. "He is trying to chemically murder my mind, Aaliyah," I whispered softly, leaning forward across the cold marble. "He's nearly $1 million in toxic corporate debt. He legally registered his fraudulent shell company to this exact address, completely exposing me to his massive federal tax liens. He is aggressively trying to steal my entire generational fortune just to save his own pathetic, miserable life." I watched a massive, incredible transformation happen right before my tired eyes. The passive, completely defeated woman who had silently ignored his arrogant insults for 3 long years completely vanished into the dark. She looked down at the heavy laboratory report, she looked at the digital voice recorder, and then she looked directly at me. The deep, heavy sadness in her eyes was instantly replaced by a cold, absolute, burning fury. She had my sharp, analytical blood running through her veins, and her quiet stubbornness finally morphed into raw, aggressive power. "I've already contacted elite federal agents in Washington," I explained calmly, placing my hand gently over hers. They are quietly building a massive federal indictment right now. They are completely tearing his fraudulent business apart. He is completely finished, Aaliyah, and he is going to federal prison for a very long time. I just needed you to fully understand the absolute truth before the heavy federal hammer completely drops on this house. She squeezed my hand incredibly hard, her sharp nails digging deeply into my thick skin. She did not cry a single tear for the man she married. We sat together in the dark kitchen, silently absorbing the massive, unforgivable betrayal. I had successfully completely broken her heart, but I had officially saved her entire life, and she finally understood exactly what had to be done. The grandfather clock in the long hallway chimed exactly 1 a.m, its deep resonance vibrating through the thick mahogany floors. The heavy sweep of bright headlights suddenly flashed across the dark kitchen windows. Tyrell was finally coming home. The low, aggressive rumble of his expensive luxury SUV engine cut sharply through the quiet Buckhead night. He parked haphazardly in the massive circular driveway, completely ignoring the perfectly painted lines. Aaliyah stood up slowly from the cold marble island. She did not hesitate for a single second. She grabbed the certified toxicology report, and she grabbed the heavy digital voice recorder, sliding them both smoothly into the deep pocket of her silk robe. Her face was a perfect mask of cold, unyielding stone. "Go back to your dark study, Dad, Aaliyah," whispered her voice completely devoid of any previous warmth or hesitation. "Let me handle this arrogant parasite tonight. You have done more than enough to completely protect us." I nodded slowly, grabbing my aluminum crutches from the hallway wall and retreating into the deep shadows of the formal living room. I needed to let her completely sever this toxic bond on her own terms. I pressed my back against the cool plaster completely hidden in the dark, watching the heavy front door. The brass handle rattled violently and the heavy oak door clicked open. Tyrell stumbled slightly into the massive foyer, the sharp, overwhelming smell of stale bourbon and cheap cigars immediately filling the pristine air. He was aggressively muttering to himself, completely consumed by his own massive financial panic, his expensive silk tie hanging loosely around his thick neck. He kicked his leather loafers off and looked up. He froze completely in his tracks. Aaliyah was standing exactly at the bottom of the grand staircase, physically blocking his direct path to the massive master suite. She was standing incredibly tall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring down at him with absolute freezing contempt. "What are you doing up so incredibly late?" Tyrell slurred, trying desperately to force a charming, completely fake smile onto his sweating face. "I just went out for a quick, quiet drive to completely clear my heavy head. The stress of your father's rapid mental decline is just completely exhausting me." "You are not sleeping in this massive house tonight, Tyrell," Aaliyah stated flatly, her voice echoing like a sharp, cracking whip in the silent foyer. Tyrell blinked his heavy, bloodshot eyes, his fake smile completely evaporating into the humid air. "What in the world are you talking about?" he demanded, taking a clumsy, aggressive step forward. "I live here, Aaliyah. This is my massive house too, and I am completely exhausted." "It is my father's house," Aaliyah corrected instantly, her voice cutting entirely through his arrogant, drunken delusion. "And you have entirely overstayed your pathetic welcome. You will turn around right now, you will walk out that heavy front door, and you will sleep in the back guest cottage until further notice." He stared at her, completely dumbfounded by her sudden absolute authority. The quiet, compliant wife he had aggressively bullied and manipulated for 3 long years was completely gone. She had been instantly replaced by a fierce, highly intelligent woman who finally saw the massive, terrifying monster standing in her foyer. "Are you seriously kicking me out of my own luxurious bedroom?" Tyrell sneered, his voice rising into a dark, aggressive shout, his hands balling into heavy fists. because I'm trying to legally protect this vulnerable family from a senile, completely broken old man. I am the only one actively trying to save this massive estate from being completely ruined by his insane mistakes." Aaliyah did not flinch, and she did not take a single step back. She took one step forward, looking directly into his cold, greedy eyes. "You are not protecting anyone, Tyrell," she said, her voice dropping into a lethal, terrifying whisper completely mirroring my own federal interrogation tactics. "You are a massive liability, and I will absolutely not let you disrespect my father under his own heavy roof ever again." She deliberately kept the massive federal investigation and the terrifying toxicology report a complete secret. She brilliantly used his blatant disrespect as the primary weapon, ensuring he completely believed this was just a standard emotional marital dispute. If he knew about the incoming federal warrants, he would immediately run for the state border. Tyrell opened his mouth to shout another vicious, manipulative lie, but the absolute unyielding certainty in her dark eyes stopped him completely cold. He looked around the massive foyer, desperately searching for a weak emotional point to exploit, but he was completely surrounded by thick, impenetrable walls. He looked toward the dark living room, completely blind to the fact that I was actively watching him, fully prepared to completely destroy him if he took one aggressive step toward my daughter. "Fine." Tyrell spat aggressively, violently, grabbing his heavy leather briefcase from the mahogany console table. "If you want to blindly defend a crazy, useless old man, you can deal with the massive, terrifying fallout tomorrow morning. I am completely done trying to help you ungrateful people." He turned around heavily, pulling the massive oak door open and stomping out into the humid Georgia night. He did not look back. The heavy door slammed shut behind him with a massive, echoing boom, completely locking him out of the main fortress forever. Aaliyah stood perfectly still for a long, heavy moment, actively listening to his heavy footsteps, crunching against the stone path, heading toward the small, isolated guest cottage in the back of the massive property. She took a deep, shaky breath, letting the heavy adrenaline slowly drain from her tired body. She pressed her hand against the deep pocket of her robe, feeling the hard plastic of the digital voice recorder. I stepped out of the dark shadows, leaving my aluminum crutches completely behind. "You did exactly what you had to do, sweetheart," I said softly, walking over to stand beside my fierce, brilliant daughter. She turned to me, her face completely composed and incredibly strong. "He is not just a terrible husband, Dad," Aaliyah whispered, staring blankly at the closed, heavy door. "He is a massive, incredibly dangerous criminal, and I will absolutely help the federal agents tear his fake empire down, brick by massive brick." I smiled a tired, incredibly proud smile, wrapping my thick arm around her shaking shoulders. The massive trap was completely set. The internal breach was fully sealed, and the arrogant parasite was now completely isolated. He was shivering in a small cottage, aggressively nursing his bruised ego, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire life was effectively over. The sun rose over the massive Buckhead estate, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawns. Tyrell was completely isolated in the back guest cottage, nursing his bruised ego and his massive financial hangover. He had absolutely no access to the main house. Aaliyah had officially changed the heavy electronic lock codes on all the exterior doors, completely sealing the massive fortress. The toxic, suffocating presence that had plagued my beautiful home for 3 long years was finally gone. But I was not taking a victory lap just yet. I had one final, crucial forensic sweep to execute. Tyrell had aggressively claimed the sprawling upstairs guest suite as his personal home office shortly after moving in.